Thank you everyone for joining us today during our session for demystifying the certification process. My background a little bit, I am a board member of ALN, but I also am the president of ABS Quality Evaluations. And our organization is a global organization that performs management system audits. And one of the programs that we do offer is ISO 55001, which is the certification standard for asset management for organizations that really want to drive their life cycles of their assets throughout their organizations. I'm pleased to today to introduce Rhys Davies. He's our global consulting leader for asset management at Atkins, chair of ISO 55000 committee. He also is the TC 251 fellow in the Institute for Asset Management. So with no further ado, Rhys, I'd like to introduce you to the group.
For my sins, I am the chair of ISO TC 251, which is the international ISO committee that looks after the ISO 55000 series of standards. So I attempt to lead 35 countries, which sounds very grand, but in practice tends to be more a matter of I prevent fights breaking out and try to make sure that some of the quieter countries get their voice heard, which is important. Can I have the next slide, please, Nick? So that's a little bit about me. I'm not going to talk about that. I think these slides get distributed later. You can read that to yourself. But the main thing is I've been heavily involved in the Institute of Asset Management, which has chapters in the US and in Canada. My current role at Atkins and across the SNC Labeling group of companies is as a kind of central center of excellence focal point. So I provide support to any members of the Atkins or SNC Labeling group of companies on strategic asset management. So I've been around a few different industries, which means I know not very much about a very wide range of things. So I think that makes me perfectly well qualified to be an asset manager. So next slide, please, Nick. So what I put on my synopsis for this presentation was I just wanted to talk about some of the big stories that are occurring at the moment in terms of environmental sustainability and some of the challenges around that, and how standards can help organizations to start to address that. And I think that's a key element. I do want to highlight towards the end the role that our Committee for Asset Management, TC 251, is playing in both capturing and communicating the practices that can assure our future, really, and perhaps for some of us assure the future for our children as well, which is possibly more relevant than our own future, as we'll probably make it. It's about our children, I think, that are critical in there. Next slide, please, Nick. So I want to start by just outlining a little bit about asset management. So these are definitions from the ISO document. So it's the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from its asset base in terms of achieving their organizational objectives. What becomes challenging and what becomes kind of the core of this discussion is what constitutes value tends to depend on the organization, its objectives, the nature and purpose of the organization, and the needs, wants, and expectations of its various stakeholder groups. Value in our asset management world is a complex beast, and most people, when they're using the language, loosely talk about only financial value when they're talking about value. But for an asset manager, value is about balancing that complex set of sometimes potentially conflicting stakeholder needs. If you just do one click, please, Nick. I don't want to dwell on these, but if we think about asset management as addressing these four big areas: one, having aligned objectives from the very top of the organization all the way down to every technician wielding a wrench on site, but also across different functions in the organization is equally important. Then we come on to probably the most important part for me. Asset management is about transparent and consistent decision-making processes. If an organization is clear on how it makes its decisions and has the mechanisms to make sure that those decisions align with the needs, wants, and expectations of its complex stakeholder groups, then it's in a good place to start to do that. And if they're able to do that transparently and consistently, then they're a good practice asset management organization. Item 3 on there is taking a long-term strategic view, and I guess this starts to lead us towards that complex beast of environmental sustainability, but I'm going to expand on that phrase as well. So whilst I highlighted that many people use the word value loosely and only talk about financial value, I think many people are also now starting to use the word sustainability too loosely, because whenever I hear it, mostly people are talking about environmental sustainability, and I think we need to talk more broadly about other forms of sustainability, so financial sustainability, social governance sustainability, business sustainability, as well as the environmental sustainability. And the last view on this list of 4 is risk-based decision-making from a position of knowledge. So that gives us a neat link into the big theme that's going on in our business world around digitalization, because that's really helping to improve many organizations' position of knowledge. And if you've got that digital part right and a clear understanding of what we mean by sustainability and are able to balance those many conflicting needs, then you're in a good position again to use asset management to assure not only our future, but that of our children and their children as well. And next slide, please, Nick. So because ISO 55000 is a management system standard, and I noticed Dominic's mentioned certification, I'm not going to talk about certification much, but I do want to talk about some things associated with the standard and certification, because I want to focus on the role of standards in helping organizations understand, share, and adopt best practice. Let's go a little bit back to first principles, which is, why do organizations have procedures in the first place? Well, most people have procedures in their organization because everywhere they've ever worked has procedures. So there's this inbuilt tendency to think that we need procedures because we have procedures. But actually, a procedure is only there to manage risk, and specifically to manage risks associated with achieving our objectives. So a good thing I always do with my clients or people I'm training on asset management is, if you come across a procedure or a process or a work instruction and you don't understand why it's there and you can't find a particular risk that it's managing, it's probably a good practice to challenge why we have the procedure in the first place. Next click, please, Nick. So it's worth noting as well that procedures or processes reduce the likelihood of an event occurring, but they can also reduce the consequences of a risk. So it's worth just thinking about that. If we think about safety risks, the procedure that requires you to wear personal protective equipment is there to reduce the consequence of a risk. It doesn't change the likelihood of it occurring, whereas you might have other barriers in place that do reduce the likelihood of an event occurring. So there might be exclusion zones or protective barriers that prevent people getting within the danger zone in the first place, reduces the probability of the event occurring, and then your PPE reduces the consequence of a risk. And I always like to remind people that different procedures either reduce likelihood or they reduce consequence, and some procedures can reduce both. One click, please, Nick, just because it's an exciting graphic and my power of PowerPoint is unbelievable. So that leads us on. If we understand that procedures are about controlling risks, that begs the question of what is a management system? And in its simplest term, a management system is just the entire collection of procedures that an organization uses to manage its collection of retained risks. It's how we understand that we are in control of all the things that might get in the way of us achieving our organizational objectives. And I like to make this point frequently, because lots of people get very hung up on management systems and think that a management system is something big and clever, but actually it's just a bag of procedures that we're using to control and manage our collection of retained risks to a level where we're happy to tolerate that. And don't forget that, I think. One click, please, Nick. What this looks like in practice. One click. So most organizations have various collections of procedures. You might have procedures in finance to control fraud or manage people's expenses, make sure payroll happens. You might have IT procedures to deal with cyber risks or make sure that users are able to access the things they need or not access the things they don't need. We all know about safety procedures, all the way around. And some of these have standards associated with them. So engineering procedures are often based on engineering technical standards, which are written by organizations like ASTM and ISO and BSI or ANSI, are all involved in writing specific sets of standards that often get encapsulated in the procedures. And I think many organizations get hung up on the fact that they have, let's take for an example, a quality management system which controls their associated quality-related risks. Many organizations will also now have environmental management systems which control their environmental-related risks. And if they're a well-advanced organization like the ones we talk to, they might also have an asset management system that controls the risks associated with their asset base in terms of delivering their organizational objectives. So one click, please, Nick. Now, what's worth mentioning here is that these management system standards, ISO 9001 for quality, ISO 14001 for environmental management, 45001 for occupational health and safety, they are just a standard. They are not a management system in themselves. They are a standard that describes what a good management system should look like. And in practice, they overlap with all of these collections of different procedures. So I am often hugely upset by organizations when I visit them where they say, and here we have our quality manual and it describes our quality management system and it's compliant with ISO 9001. In isolation, that's not too bad. But then you go over and they say, here's our environmental management system handbook and it has a different set of procedures in that manage our environmental related risks in accordance with ISO 14001. Now I think that's wrong. Many organizations should just have all the procedures they use to manage their environmental risks, their quality-related risks, their occupational health and safety-related risks, all their wider risks associated with their asset base. And one click, please, Nick. And I think this red circle here is the organization's management system. And if they are doing it right, and if their certification body is doing their certification assessment correctly as well, they should be steering their way through the organization's collection of risk management processes for finance, for information, for safety, for engineering, and checking that they have all the necessary parts in place against those management system standards. And the question is, why is that important? Well, it's important because those management system standards represent the collection of what good looks like. What is the good acceptable level of quality management? What is the good acceptable level of environmental management? And it defines a minimum set of risk controls, if you like, that you need to have in place to be compliant with those standards. It's not something you should just blindly adopt and claim I have a quality management system. But let's look a little bit at ISO. One click, please, Nick. Just to highlight, ISO is the international organization. It has 165 national standards bodies, and it brings together experts to share knowledge and develop voluntary, consensus-based, market-relevant international standards. And I think some of those words in there are particularly relevant. Buried in the front of every ISO standard for management systems is a couple of paragraphs that describe that all of these standards are voluntary. They're not mandatory. In some jurisdictions, you tend to find that regulators or governments might make them mandatory for some industry sectors. But when we write them, we are written on the basis that people will adopt them voluntarily. And the intent is that we are gathering the expert knowledge from the groups of experts, sharing what good looks like so that people can understand best practice, share best practice, and implement best practice in their organizations. If they then seek certification, it's a useful thing for them to do where it benefits some of their stakeholder groups. Okay? Next slide, please, Nick. So what? So we've got objectives for our organizations. Some of those objectives are environmental, some are quality, some are asset performance, some are financial. We have risks to objectives, so the things that provide a degree of uncertainty about achieving those objectives. And that means because we have risks to those objectives, we put in place processes to manage that risk. And then because all organizations have lots of different kinds of risks and lots of different kinds of objectives, we use management systems as the collection of processes to manage our corporate retained risks. And where we use standards to communicate, learn, and influence good practice. Okay? So, what about the big picture? I started my presentation talking about sustainability. One click, please, Nick. So what are the big trends? Next click, please. So I think one big area of trend that we're seeing in a lot of asset-intensive industries and in organizations generally is that trend towards digital migration. So I've got some images where we move from the more traditional dashboard in our car and the controls we utilize up to, I think this is actually an image of a Tesla. I do drive an electric vehicle myself, but clearly it's a Jaguar, not a Tesla. It's a far superior vehicle. Now, I don't particularly want to talk about digital migration, but it is an important trend. It's an important trend which influences quite a lot of things as well. The big ones I do want to talk about, one click please, Nick, thank you, is environmental sustainability up in the top right-hand corner, and also new financial models. And I think this comes back to a hugely important part. So the top right-hand one, environmental sustainability, I'd like to highlight that most people are using the word sustainability very loosely. There is a mention of sustainability, and when people are talking about it, invariably they are only talking about environmental sustainability. And in itself, that's not a bad thing. Environmental sustainability is hugely important. But what it does mean is that we are seeing a massive focus at the moment on a single measure, and that measure tends to be carbon. And as asset managers, we know that most organizations, if you want to solve complex problems, you need to solve a complex multivariable problem. And being able to deal with that solely in terms of one parameter like carbon pretty much leads us into the same place, or down the same route that got us into this place in the first place. I think if you are following a single variable solution to a complex multivariable problem, you will not solve the problem. So I think that's an important element. For me, sustainability is a multivariable problem. It's not just about managing carbon. It's about managing carbon. It's about managing social governance. It's about managing financial aspects as well, which kind of leads me to the one in the middle. For a number of years now, we've been familiar with phrases such as the triple bottom line, which has been trying to get organizations to move a little bit further on than just financial criteria for making decisions, which comes back to my other misused word earlier on, which is value. Usually when people are saying my initiative will add value, they are only talking about financial value. What I'm starting to see in various parts of the world and in a number of different industries is a slow realization that moving towards a more complex financial reporting standard like the 6 capitals model, where we bring into place human capital, social and relationship capital, intellectual capital, natural capital, which is hugely important, as well as the more traditional financial and manufactured capital. These things are coming. We are certainly seeing our regulated wastewater industries in the UK and in other parts of Europe becoming more interested in regulating those industries using a broader integrated reporting framework, such as the 6 capitals model, which is becoming more complex. Now, to summarize some of these things on here, you will hear a lot in the media and from commentators about sustainability being about the environment and being about carbon, one-dimensional description of a multivariable complex problem. When we then start to look at financial modeling, we're seeing a slow evolution away from the single measure of dollars, pounds, euros, yen towards 6 capitals, and that is also therefore a complex multivariable problem. And my argument, and I think where we're starting to see things develop in the standards community, is that asset management as a discipline has a history of dealing with complex multivariable problems and balancing the needs of multiple stakeholder groups. Next slide, please, Nick. So standards, in my perspective, are a good means to gather good practice, influence good practice, and then also communicate good practice. So the problems like environmental sustainability in its broadest sense, not just carbon, is a multivariable problem. Moving from a single measure of value like the dollar, pound, yen, euro, towards wider financial models like the six capitals is also a complex multivariable problem. We think as a community of asset managers, we have a much better understanding of managing complex multivariable decision-making problems, and we need to develop that thinking both in our existing communities, and let's be clear here, the asset management standards community has an audience, but we also need to develop new standards for different communities. And I think historically, the standards community hasn't been great at reaching out to one hugely influential group, which is that group of financiers and investors. Next slide, please, Nick. So where we are at the moment, ISO TC 207 is the Environmental Management Committee. They have a long history of developing the ISO 14000 series of standards. Probably the most famous one is the 14001 Management System Standard for managing environmental related risks. For me, and I talk regularly with the chair of that committee, it's probably the only other management system standard along with 55000 which mandates a long-term view. I think that's hugely important. ISO 55000, we've got clauses in there that explicitly mandate long-term whole asset life thinking that forces an organization outside of a typical business planning cycle. ISO 14001 similarly requires long-term environmental impact assessments across the life cycle of whatever the environmental thing they're considering is. So I think they're the only two management system standards that explicitly force organizations into a long-term, whole life view of risk associated with the environment, financial performance, and so on. Second bullet is my own committee, ISO TC 251. We're currently in the middle of developing some work on complex multivariable decision making for asset management, helping to capture what good practice organizations do in terms of balancing safety risk, environmental risk, financial risk, performance risk, reputational risk, understanding how organizations do that, how they get knowledge from their stakeholder groups about what their real needs, wants, expectations, and tolerance to accept different forms of risk are. And we're working on a number of papers in the background that hopefully in the future will weave their way into standards once we develop some consensus around there. Next click, please, Nick. And then there's a new committee, which we're strongly engaged in, which is ISO TC 322 on sustainable finance. Now, I think why this is important is if we go back to 207, the Environmental Management Committee, as well as the standards we all know and love on environmental management systems, they also have a number of standards relating to things like green bonds to encourage financial investment. But those green bonds, again, are very carbon focused, so it's a single dimensional measure of decision making, and I think that has its own weaknesses. We know that environmental sustainability is a complex multivariable problem, and you're never going to solve it with a single dimensional solution like green bonds. So what's happening in the 322 sustainable finance community is a number of interesting things. Firstly, it's drawing in a new audience. It's an audience of people who are developing the standards, understanding the standards, and sharing best practice that involves the investment community. So we will see people like Macquarie's Green Investment Bank heavily involved in that development because they want to understand how, as an investor, they can get assurance that A, they are choosing the projects and the organizations that are right to invest in, that are capable of dealing with multivariable complex decision making, not just carbon, but across environmental sustainability, financial sustainability, and this is why the finance community is important. They want to understand long-term sustainable financial investment. as well as reputational and social governance sustainability. So it's very much broadening it out to a multivariable discussion. And I think this is, I'm really excited about this. I think this is an area where we genuinely have the potential to take the good work we've been doing in asset management, link it together with the great work that the environmental management community has done over the last probably 25 years, and bring it together and show it to a new audience, which is financial investment community. One click, please, Nick. So, TC322, active engagement from environmental, asset management community, and the financial community. And I think, for me, this is hugely important. It's an example of how standards and that worldwide community of experts can bring different disciplines together and hopefully present it to a new audience. And it's a small hope that we can leave a better world for our children and their children. I think that's the end of my slides, Nick. Just click one more time. That looks pretty good. Yeah, there we go. Beautiful picture of the Earth to lead you on. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully, I think I was under time slightly, so that's quite amazing for me. I'll hand it back to Dominic.
Rhys, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. We have a couple questions that I'd like to ask. The first one, you talked a little bit about triple bottom line. Question came in, how do you compare the 6 capitals model to the term triple bottom line?
Yeah, you probably catch me out on that because I don't specifically compare them. I think they're just a different way of looking at things. The triple bottom line is looking at kind of the revenue side of things. And I think what I like about the 6 capitals is we live in a world which is run under capitalism. And I think by looking at capitals, different forms of capital, that's probably a more sustainable long-term way of looking at it. I think what's interesting about, I'm about to say something which is a generalization and isn't always true, but generally I find that if you look at P&L accounts in organizations, it's very easy to generate a strong financial return on any particular financial reporting period. But it's much more challenging to generate long-term position changes on the balance sheet, which is the capital element of it. Now, if we're genuinely all about a long-term solution, then we should be seeking to influence the long-term balance sheet. And the 6 capital model starts to look at different forms of capital on the balance sheet, and that inherently means it's a longer-term solution. I can generate a return in one financial year every time because you just cut something and you will generate a short-term return. If we start looking on balance sheet impact in terms of 6 different capitals, not just financial capital, then we're starting to think longer term, and I think that's the difference for me.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, Rhys. You know, when I look at even in our own business models, a lot of organizations do focus on the financial model, but when you look at balance sheets and cash position, there's a lot of other areas that are important for your long-term sustainability. Making it a little bit more granular about asset management is like, you know, also how are you managing your assets through its life cycle to drive value, making sure that they stay running, keeping your business activities flowing. So there's a lot of things that connect together. So I agree with you, Rhys, on that situation. Another question, you had talked about case studies. Can you highlight any best practices that you've seen and that you've discussed in your presentation?
I think there's a number of best practices now around multivariable decision making. I quite like what a lot of the Dutch utilities do. I think in the Netherlands they have a very open approach to discussing different stakeholder needs, and certainly they're able to do something that we don't do very well in the UK, certainly in terms of trying to balance financial performance and the one that's always difficult, safety performance. We tend to come out with words like safety is the most important thing, but in practice, when you look at how organizations genuinely make decisions, the words will say safety, but usually financial performance tends to dominate in some way. And I think the Dutch have a very good way of being open and transparent about talking about how they balance safety with environment, with people, with finance. And I think the Dutch utilities have some really good examples. There's a great PhD thesis from a few years ago from, I think it was Delft University, where the PhD guy looked at how the Dutch utilities had addressed that, and that's certainly an interesting piece of work. And I think some of it's probably not case studies yet. I think we're in a position where organizations have done a lot with environmental management already, and the green bonds has been very useful in terms of getting a focus on CO2 related investment benefits. But the stuff that's going on in TC322, and we're not there yet, but we do have the finance community involved in the discussion, and we're talking about how we balance long-term environmental sustainability, not carbon, sorry, carbon's clearly in there, not just carbon, but also long-term financial sustainability and other forms of environmental impact. I said I am an EV driver. You've only got to consider an EV and the complexity of it. In CO2 terms, they're great. The benefits case is easy. But I also know as an engineer that those vehicles are full of rare earth metals, which are polluting the planet in different ways that aren't carbon in terms of the way they're extracted from the earth. I know that many of the mining companies are probably using interesting employment practices, which means from a social perspective, they're not necessarily great. We understand the combustion engine. We've done it for years. But there's this massive rush from combustion engines to EVs, which I think genuinely is good. But we still as a society have to address the other forms of impact. We're rushing to eliminate CO2. Yes, good thing to do, I agree, but we also need to consider the other environmental impacts, social impacts, long-term governance impacts as well. And that's still to be addressed. And we have those discussions in TC322. It's one of the most exciting things I get involved in.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, do you include opportunity management in your consideration of risk management?
Yeah, most definitely. You may be aware that there's a massive argument raging in the standards community internationally about risk and opportunity, and I'm not going to engage in it. It's an argument of semantics, and for me, I'm interested in helping organizations to make better decisions about managing uncertainty. I don't quite care whether you call it risk or opportunity. And there is a massive argument in the standards community, which I'm sure you're aware of, Dominic.
There is.
And it's semantics as well. They're just arguing over words. We all understand we need to manage uncertainty and manage risk or opportunity, however you call it. It's becoming a barrier to the real problem, which is talking about where we spend our money to get best benefit.
Very true. There's three main objectives with this standard: better control over daily activities, higher return with your assets, and then reduce the total cost of risk. Can you give us some examples, particularly with the higher return of assets? What are some of the methodologies organizations will measure and monitor that?
It's specifically on higher return on assets. So
yes.
I'm not sure that many organizations do that well. I still think they focus. So I work for a consulting organization. I know that my route of entry into most clients is generally about reducing capital expenditure or reducing OPEX expenditure, and that leads you to the asset investment planning and the asset performance management. Those are my routes in. They're inherently short-term routes, but as a person, as a consultant, I'm interested in making sure that they then start to think long-term. I certainly have discussions with organizations about long-term return on capital employed, return on assets on the balance sheet are good measures, but I think many organizations are still quite short-term, even those that are openly adopting asset management and talking about whole life costs. There's still a step to get them to genuinely think about long-term return on assets on the balance sheet or return on capital employed. And there are some organizations doing it better than others, but we're still some way away from that.
Excellent. Thank you, Rhys. I think this was our last question that was posed. I appreciate your presentation. It was very informative, and me personally, I've learned a few things myself, so I thought it was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And when you're in Manchester, give me a call.
I will. I certainly will.